Between school, your friends, and social media, answers are everywhere. But where can you find the truth? Welcome to the StudentCast. We're asking for a friend so you don't have to.
What's up, party people? We are back at the StudentCast, asking questions for a friend so you don't have to. My name is Brynn, and I'm here with my friend
Ka'eo. I am so glad to be here today. It is a rainy, moody day, Brynn.
Yeah, seriously.
And it is just not the vibes for me.
No, I am over the rain.
Honestly, I don't think I would have ever been like, you know what? I'm going to get to the point where I'm over the rain.
Yeah, especially not here in Fresno.
I'm kind of over it. And it seems to always happen on a Tuesday and Wednesday.
Yes.
And I'm done.
Done.
We'd like the
it.
sunshine. I literally was talking to my therapist the other day about how, like, look, sometimes we're in constant seasons where it feels like the season should be ending, but it's not. And I was like, yeah, we're just in a season of suffering. And I was like, my suffering looks different than other people, but this is what it looks like. And then I don't know why, but then we decided to put a joke being like, you know, maybe we can say we're out of season next year. You know, be like, you know what? Maybe next month we're out of the season of suffering.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
You know how like sometimes in stores like, oh, we're out of stock, or it's just a seasonal item.
You're
you
like,
know?
I simply have no more capacity of suffering.
Yeah.
I do not have
I
it.
don't want it anymore. I would like my
It's so
chocolate milk
hard.
back, you know?
Yeah.
So,
It's so
yes.
interesting. You said how your suffering looks different than like other people's.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's just because like I feel like we often feel like, well, my suffering's not as bad as theirs. You know, like, oh, I got a hangnail this morning, and
Yeah.
that kind of ruined my day.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, like my outfit just isn't. I'll be honest. Sometimes my suffering is that I have this little poof on my hair, and it just decides to do whatever it wants. And I'm like, it doesn't matter how much gel I put in it or whatever product in it, it still is poofy.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm like, yeah, this is my cross to bear, which is a misquoted line. You
Yeah,
know? Or it's
totally.
my thorn in my side.
Yep. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But for
Yeah.
other people, it's like their suffering is like I've lost somebody,
Yeah.
or like I failed a test, can't get my driver's license,
Yeah.
my siblings pick on me, you know,
Yeah.
or like some graver things of like sickness and disease.
When we all have different capacities for suffering too, right? Like, what's the quote that you say? I always butcher it, but that like whether we're drowning in 6 feet of water
Or 6 inches.
Yeah. That either way it's suffering.
Yeah.
Or it's drowning.
Yes.
Sorry.
Either way, you're drowning.
Yeah.
Yeah. In a puddle or an ocean, you're
There
still
we
drowning
go.
if your
Yeah.
head face in it. Yeah,
Yeah.
there we go.
Yeah. But that kind of brings us to what our question is today, because sometimes when we are walking through suffering, we tend to question if the Lord's really for us. And this question gets brought up a lot. Like, Ka'eo, if God is good, then why do bad things happen?
Yeah, I'm currently suffering because this person asked us this question. It is not a fun one. It's
No,
not
it's
a
so
fun one
hard.
at all. And so listeners out there, like, I pray that you just buckle up as we kind of walk through this question. It is not a fun one. And honestly, it's probably a question that we've all asked ourselves
Yeah.
and asked the Lord too. Like, if you're so good, God, why do you allow all these bad things to happen? Why are you allowing these bad things to happen to me?
Yeah. And I think we see this question kind of come up in two ways. We talked about how like when suffering arises, we'll have this question. I think that we'll also approach this question when we're like, if someone is doubting the existence of God, or like if you're in a conversation with someone who's like, Christianity's not real, like, and this is a way that people will try to disprove the existence of God. And so we're trying to meet this middle of like where the like intellectual argument and emotional argument, how those coincide, because I feel like that's the sweet spot.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I have often experienced this question a lot when people are like, I cannot reconcile what the world looks like. And yet God, it says, he declares that he is good.
Yeah.
And so if that's true, or they say he is loving. you
Yeah.
know?
Well, okay. So you just brought up the point. What I feel like before we even get into anything else, we have to define what good and what bad is. Like if we're saying the question is, if God is good, why do bad things happen? We have to define what good and bad are.
Yeah, I think that's even harder to do because I feel like everyone has their own nuances of good and bad. Here's an example. I remember in seminary, this like broke my brain. My professor was like, okay, imagine, well, I think it's funny because it's raining, but he was like, okay, imagine that there's a street, all right? On one side is a wedding venue, and on the other side is a farmer. And he goes, and it rains, and it's their wedding day. To the farmer, this is the best day of his life.
Yeah.
To the bride and groom, this is the worst day of their life.
That's so.
But the rain is not bad.
No.
The rain fell, but because their context and where they're at and their desires of their own hearts, the rain was bad for the wedding because of how it impeded whatever, and I get it. But for the farmer, this was a blessing.
Yeah.
And so like, I think oftentimes we have to recognize that our definition of good and bad is not the same as the Lord's.
That's so good.
And so I think that's why even this question is really hard, because it's like, okay, you're trying to place on the Lord a definition that honestly is not by the same rules and standards that he is.
Yeah.
So we recognize that like, yeah, like it is bad, but why is it bad? Oh, because it inconveniences you, or is it like actually a form of suffering? Do you see what I'm saying? And so.
Yeah. And I think the defining good in terms of like what we see as good on this earth is a really dangerous place to be. Yeah. Because we're not designed for this earth. Like we are designed by God to live with him eternally in heaven. And so anything on this earth is not what we're designed to like take joy in.
Yeah.
We're supposed to take joy in the Lord because that's who we're going to be with eternally in heaven.
Yeah. It's not saying that the things here on earth can't be enjoyable, but the idea is that they cannot be like, they're not like the best thing, right?
No, and they're not the definition of good.
No, God is, and God is good. And anything kind of outside of his design, we probably say is probably bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great place to start. I think as we're talking about this, I think we kind of have to go back to the beginning to understand where bad comes from. And so we see in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that is when sin enters the earth. So God did not design us originally with sin on this earth.
Yeah, no, that was not his original design.
No. And so he didn't create evil, but he made it possible, and man made it actual.
Yes. Yeah, by our choices. The Lord was like, look, like I'm going to give you this choice because he didn't want robots in the garden.
No.
He wanted a relationship.
No, and his hearts have relationship. And so if we don't have choice or like what we call free will, then there's no actual love or relationship.
There's no value to our choices. Yeah.
And so I heard like an interesting like thing that kind of blew my mind on this. But if we want evil and bad erased from this earth, then in order to do that, the Lord would have to erase the cause of it. And by doing that, he erases our choices. And without that, we also don't get to experience like the good results of our choices, where like we experience love and maturing and relationships and like all those things. If he eliminates the cause of sin and the cause of evil, then we don't have choice.
Yeah.
And therefore we don't have an actual relationship with him.
That almost makes life feel awful.
Like purposeless.
Yeah, it seems weird. I don't know why. And that makes sense that loving God would be like, that's not how I would design this to be, you know?
Yeah.
That's insane. Yeah, I remember just like jokingly, my friends would be like, gosh, this world's terrible. You know, like, oh, like I can't even turn on the news, or I can't get on social media or whatever. And I remember our friends would be like, yeah, ever since Genesis 3, man, the world sucked. And I was like, well, you're not wrong, but it doesn't make me feel better.
No.
You know, it doesn't make me feel better.
No. And like, I think the crazy part is that we're like, okay, but God, like, why did this choice have to result in what our world looks like? Like, okay, Adam and Eve ate an apple. Like okay, like what, how did we get here? Like the things we see in the world today, like how did we get here? And so I'm being dramatic, but I think that is like, it is a question that I've heard. And so I think what we have to like recognize is that the world wasn't originally created to look this way.
No.
But with the choice that Adam and Eve made to disobey the Lord, there had to be results.
Yeah,
and there had to be consequences.
Yes.
And so with that, like there is an altered ecosystem, and there is like, we now have dying physical bodies, and that leads to sicknesses and things that are so hard to wrap our minds around how those could be like part of God's plan or things like that. But if we don't have results of like sin and suffering in our world, then that again means that our choices don't matter and they don't have a weight when they do.
They do. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm still stuck on the fact that you're like, all this happened because they ate a piece of fruit. And I recognize just the audacity of that claim is ridiculous. Like, how did all this happen? But that is how it played out, you know? And now I don't want to eat apples anymore. But like, I recognize there's some levity here, but it doesn't take away from the fact that yes, like, yeah, like our broken world now, because of Adam and Eve's decisions, now allowing us to be separated from the Lord and the original design not in place. Now there are things like you said, just disease, cruelty, poverty, just like there's like sin runs rampant in this world. you'll see the effects of pride like outblown everywhere, you know? And that was just never how God designed it to be. And now we are sitting here being like, yeah, and we were also never designed to be here. Yeah. And we're supposed to be with the Lord, you know?
Yeah. I think, so we see something, we're talking about like these ways we suffer and like kind of where they originated from. Like, okay, maybe we have somewhat of a grasp on like, this is how we got here. But I think an encouragement in this we find in 1 Peter 1:6-7 says, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. I think that's where we see like, I don't know, even in my own story, I'm like, some of the things I considered the most like times of suffering in my life have also brought me the closest to the Lord and see his character in such a new way. And so I don't know, how have you kind of seen the Lord use suffering or things that we see as bad in your life?
For sure. We hate suffering in general. I don't think anyone likes being, even the word refined, like I don't think anyone likes to be refined.
Like, I'm okay with just being,
like just
stop
honest.
refining me.
There's a season where I'm like, all right, Lord, I think I already learned the lesson. We can get out of this season. That'd be great. Like if the whole point was to teach me how to make sure I ask like for help to build a boat during a flood, I already figured that out. You know, we're on 2 boats now. But the idea is that I think suffering often allows us to get to the point where we can no longer be dependent on ourselves. It gets us to the bottoms. And I love that, like just even in like Psalm 23, when David's like, look, like he's going to walk with me through the valley of the shadow of death. It doesn't say he's going to rescue me out of it. He will just walk with me. Like his presence is better and often enough. And so I think suffering often reminds me of like that God is always with me. And that also gets my pride or my like self like sufficiency, my autonomy, which is ultimately sin when I'm trying to operate outside of the Lord. It brings me back to him and have a like holy like reliance and like or wholesome reliance on the Lord.
Yeah. I feel like we see that in like David's life a lot. In 1 Samuel when he's promised to be king. Like God's like, you will be king over this land.
But it didn't happen overnight.
And it didn't happen right away. And I feel like when I think of like promises the Lord has, I'm like, okay, like let's get to the point. But like we see in David's life, he's promised this and it's like nearly 15 years of like.
It's 15 years?
I think it's nearly that.
Oh my gosh.
Like, yeah.
I think I would give up on this promise.
Yeah. And before that actually happens, and in the meantime, his life on earth is
it sucked.
Horrible.
Yeah, it was terrible.
I like made notes of the things he like loses a lot in that time span. He his like best friend, kind of like mentor figure, Jonathan, dies.
Oh my gosh.
Him and his wife kind of like separate. His wife like betrays him and is like, here, Dad, Saul, like this is where he is, like whatever.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I remember.
He loses his job. Samuel, who's like his spiritual influence, dies, and then like towards the end,
he's on the run too.
He's literally hiding in caves.
Yeah.
He loses like his pride and his sanity, like kind of goes crazy for a second. And so like, this is who God told is going to be king. And that is what that period of his life looked like.
Oh gosh.
And so I think of that story and I'm like, okay, like that is not what we would deem as good, but the Lord had a good plan the whole time. Does that make sense?
Oh my gosh, yes. Like he was just in the middle of like the book. Yeah. And God's like, no, I promise you, literally the next page, like it will be good. This is refining you to be the king I've always wanted you to be.
And that's what makes him, like, I feel like if David became king right when God had promised that, I don't think that he would have been the king that he ended up being. But when he does eventually become king, sure, he has a lot of his like struggles, as we all do. But he does some things, but he does still have like a heart for the Lord and like goes back to him. Yeah. And I don't know if he would have done that without that period of like having the Lord remove everything from his life.
That's real. Yeah.
Before that.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the whole point that like God's ways are higher than ours and his thoughts are higher. And it is like, I don't know. I think it's very much like Job when it's like, who are we to question the Lord during that time? I recognize as we say these things, though, it doesn't provide you comfort. Like to the listeners, especially like ourselves when we're processing this, like probably in the midst of suffering, it's like, it doesn't make me feel any better. I'm just not sure where we're supposed to make you feel any better.
Yeah. There is that. I have used this out of context in my own life. I think it's in Romans 8, talking about how like everything will be good in the end.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, again, that goes back to, that's not that feels really comforting in the sense of if that's promising that everything in my personal life circumstantially will feel good one day. And I think the not comforting part, but the like thing that I guess is a promise is that like it might not make sense, but like God is still good in that.
Yes.
And Francis Chan says it in a way where he says, not being able to fully understand God is frustrating, but it's ridiculous for us to think we have the right to limit God to something we are capable of comprehending.
Yeah. Ooh,
and so it's like
bars.
We take comfort in the fact that the God we worship is not, we can't understand him. Because I don't want to worship myself. Yeah. I would be a horrible God.
I would definitely be
And so like we get to take comfort and rest in the fact that the Lord is so beyond our understanding and his sovereignty is something that we can't grasp.
Yeah.
And that's what we get to take comfort in because I don't want to take comfort in the things that are around me. This world, we have acknowledged this world is trash.
It's awful.
Like there's so much hardness. And I think we'd be missing it if we didn't just like say, we're so sorry for the ways that you are experiencing suffering and like the ways that you are sitting and what's brought you to this question potentially to be like, I don't understand how this could ever be part of God's plan.
Yeah.
But I think our encouragement is like wrestle with that, feel the permission to grieve that and feel it. But like also knowing and resting in the fact that God, his character is still good.
Yeah. All throughout the Bible, people have lamented towards the Lord, being like, God, why are you, while you're saying that, I'm even reminded of Habakkuk who stands at the tower being like, Lord, look at all of this brokenness around me. Yeah. Where are you? God is big enough to handle those things.
When we talk about, I'm the one, I mentioned David's life. While that's going on, the Psalms he writes are like literally like, God, where are you?
They're sometimes kind of complaining. Like, what the heck, Lord? And it's like, but then at the same time, it's like, oh, wait, that's how I'm feeling right now.
Yes. Yeah. And so like the permission for you, God is big enough to handle your doubts, your frustrations, your questions, but he wants to like wrestle through those with you, not apart from you.
Yeah. I wonder what this like does even like, just how it bolsters our own faith too. Like the faith it takes just to be like in the waiting, I'm waiting for the answer. Yeah. And maybe I'll never get that answer. But I think if God has been the same yesterday, today, and forevermore, then his goodness in like the past and the present will still be the same in the future. You know, like I'm holding on to the promises of God yesterday into today, you know, like the fact that God like brought people out of their suffering. It took a lot of time. Like I'm imagining the Israelites, it was like what, 40 years and just rummaging around in the wilderness.
I'm not even 40 years old. That's longer than my lifetime.
So I'm like,
I'm half of that.
It was like and then it's like 400 years. It kind of went for a while, you know. And it's like, oh my gosh, like it was generations and generations before the Lord's promises came fulfilled. And so I'm like, maybe, just maybe, like we don't have an answer for the current suffering that you're in, but it doesn't mean that God isn't good.
Yeah. I think my last thought is a story. Actually, one of our students used this analogy when they were explaining like their own processing with the Lord to me, and it blew my mind. But the idea of like, I've never weaved a quilt, but from what I've been told is if you're making a quilt and you're weaving it, maybe that should be my new hobby.
Oh, all right.
That'd be kind of cool. Okay. But so you're weaving a quilt, and if you're looking at the back of it, it just looks like a bunch of random threads that are like a mess. You're like, what is this? What is this? I don't know how to make a quilt. I thought I did. I don't know how to. And then you flip it over and then you see the pattern that it made.
Tapestry,
and so I think even in that sense, like we are, if not just like one of the little threads on the back of a quilt. But like God is writing a beautiful story of ultimately like the redemption of all his people.
Yeah. Dang, that's really good. Wow. That also reminded me, I would just encourage you too, like as you're in the waiting and being like, I'm wrestling with this, like, Lord, why is this even happening? Like, okay, help me understand. I always cling on to Revelation 21 verse 4. It says that it's talking about like God himself coming and like essentially restoring back his people in the new heaven and earth. He goes, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And that is the biggest hope we're waiting on. And maybe, like you say, we won't see in our lifetime, but we know that is what is coming. And so we'll hold on to that even in the present day suffering, and recognizing that we're also just suffering just like the way Christ did. And that's one way that we can even like almost grow closer at like as a relationship to him.
Yeah.
Again, we recognize it doesn't make your suffering any better.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, as always, our heart is not for this, like, podcast ended, let's never revisit this topic again. But I think just for this to start the conversation, and like connect with your people, connect with the Lord, connect with like mentors about what is it that you are suffering through right now. And that can also be some of like the biggest ways we connect as God's people is like, hey, we might be suffering differently, but like we're in this together.
Yeah.
And I connect with something you said there, even though circumstantially it might be different in my life. And so, reach out. Vulnerability is strength.
It is.
Despite what the world may say.
Yep.
But yeah, we're proud of you guys. We see you, we hear you. This was a fun one.
This is a fun one. We'll be seeing, I'm sure we'll be revisiting this conversation again soon.
Yeah.
So we're praying for all of you. Go ahead, like and subscribe. I know it seems weird right now, and go ahead and put the 5 stars and leave a review because we just really enjoy hanging out with you.
We do.
And so anyways, we'll see you in a couple weeks. So with that being said, bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Well StudentCast. As always, don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about us. For more information about the Well Student Ministries, visit thewellcommunity.org/students.